Now that we have a project that does something quite cool, not just displaying data, but actually inserting data into Elasticsearch, I think now is the right time to talk about delivery semantics in depth. So let's talk about at-most ones. At-most ones are basically when offsets are committed as soon as the message batch is received. This is not what we're doing right now. We're in at least ones. But when you're at most ones, basically, if your processing of the data goes wrong, and by processing for this example, I mean inserting data into Elasticsearch, if that goes wrong, the message will be lost. It will never be read again because we have committed the offsets before inserting the data into Elasticsearch. Now, if you want to see visually how that works, this is our partition on the left-hand side with the offsets, and we have a consumer from a consumer group. And so the first thing it's going to do is read the data in batch. So it's going to read a small batch of maybe 5 or 6 messages. And it's going to say, okay, I've received all these messages. Now I want to commit the offsets. So we haven't seen how to do this yet, but I'll show you later. We are committing the offsets. Kafka says, okay. Then our consumer group starts processing data. So in my slide, it's send an email, but in our code, that was insert into Elasticsearch. So we say, okay, I'm inserting this one, this one. And it turns out that as soon as we're done processing the third message, our consumer goes down, the machine shuts down. So that's okay, that happens all the time. But what happens when it comes back up? When it comes back up, it's going to read from the last committed offsets. So it's going to read from that giant orange bar. And so when it reads the next batch, it's going to process 4262, 4264, etc. And so what happens is that the 4261 here are not being processed. So these two things are not being processed. They've been skipped because we have committed the offsets too early. And so when we restart, we just don't read that data again. And so this is why this is called at most ones, because there's a chance of losing data if your consumer goes down. Now maybe something you want. Maybe sometimes you don't care about losing data, you just care about moving on. But I think it's quite a bad behavior sometimes. Now, at least once is a default behavior, and we'll see how to control this. But at least once is when offsets are committed after the message is processed. So if the processing goes wrong now, the messages will be read again. But this means that you can have duplicate processing of messages. So we have to make sure that our processing is idempotent. And by idempotent, I mean that processing the messages again won't impact our systems. So here's our example. We have our consumer group, and it's going to do a first batch of reads. Then it's going to process data, so it's going to insert into Elasticsearch. And all these things happen great. Then there's going to be a commit offsets that happens afterwards. So as you can see now in this example, we first processed data and then we committed the offsets. And then we process the new data points. So the first 2, first 3, and then turns out that our consumer goes down. That happens as well. Now our consumer comes back up, and the first thing it's going to do is say, hey, Kafka, where do I start reading from? And Kafka says, you need to start reading from 4262. So it says, okay, because this is where it was last committed. So it says, okay, and it reads again, 4262, 4264, 4265, and moves on. So as you can see in this case, 4263, 4264, and 4265 have been consumed twice. So this is why it's called at least once, because in case of restarts, there's a chance that you're going to read the messages again. And so in our case, this processing of inserting the data 4262 into our database will happen twice, and that can generate duplicates unless your processing is idempotent. So we'll see how we can make our processing idempotent, but I just wanted to give you an idea. So for summary, there's at most once, at least once, and we've seen these two, and then there's exactly once, which is only for Kafka to Kafka workflow using Kafka streams. So bottom line, and we'll see this in the next lecture in the hands-on, for most applications, you should definitely use at least once processing, and we'll ensure that the transformation and the processing, for example, when we insert into Elasticsearch, is going to be idempotent. So if you're curious about how we do this in real life, then I will see you in the next lecture.